Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. Use the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. Tess and I are both here on the West Coast. Mickey is in Michigan. Where are you? Don't be shy. Here we go. Houston, Texas. Hello, welcome.
Houston.
We'll let hello, Jill in Seattle. We will let a few more people get tuned in before we get started. Welcome, welcome. All right, we'll give it just a few more seconds and then we will get going. San Jose, hello. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop here in Seattle, Washington called Book Larder. And over the next couple of months, we will get our in-person author talks going again. But for the time being, and probably actually for the foreseeable future, we will continue to do author talks here on Zoom. And the great part of that is that we can have a conversation like the one tonight, where our author is in one state, our interviewer is in another, and then all of you are all over the country. So thank you so much for being here. I'm really delighted to welcome Micheline Maynard. We can call her Mickey. She is a senior producer, a senior editor at NPR Here and Now, and contributing columnist at the Washington Post, and of course now the author of this fantastic new book, Satisfaction Guaranteed: How Zingermans Built a Corner Deli into a Global Food Community. Mickey typically writes about business, and so this is both a look at the business side of Zingermans, but also at all of sort of the food and the special and the things that make it special. She is going to be in conversation with Tess Vigeland. Tess is a senior producer and podcast host at the Wall Street Journal. And the two of them are, of course, going to talk about the book. They will also leave time for questions. So if you could please use the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for those questions, that will allow them to be a little more organized than if they're just in the chat. So you can use the chat to sort of talk to each other, share your memories of Zingermans, whatever you want to do in the chat. But if you have questions for Mickey and Tess, please put those in the Q&A. The talk tonight is actually being recorded, and so it will be on the Book Larder YouTube channel within the next probably 24 to 48 hours. And you can actually see all of the author talks that we've done over Zoom over the past couple of years there, and there's a lot of really good stuff there if you want to go check it out. You can support the talk by, of course, purchasing the book from Book Larder. I will drop a link to do that in the chat to make it easy for you, and thank you for everyone that's done that so far. And I think that's all that I have. Let's go ahead and get started. And please join me in welcoming Mickey Maynard and Tess Vigeland.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. Thank you so much, Laura. That was a lovely introduction. And Mickey, hi. I haven't seen you in a long time.
Nice to see you. The last time Tess and I saw each other was in New Orleans, and we had a wonderful time running around the city.
And not only running around the city, but we took some cooking classes. And I remember making this incredible remoulade. I don't know if you remember what else did we make?
I think there was a wonderful dessert. I think it was like a bananas Foster that was ice cream, and they sat us down at a big table with a lot of wine. I remember that.
Right.
That was in the meantime, you've been all over the world, and I've been writing. So
that's right. That's right. We both have led some really fun lives, especially over the last couple of years. But you and I actually met about 20 years ago or so when I was at Marketplace.
Right.
And Mickey was a regular on our shows, and for the most part, talking about the airlines and the automotive industry.
Right. Yeah.
And that's when you were with the Times, and you were a rock star at that point. But I will tell
Oh,
you,
thank you.
that you hit the stratosphere as far as I was concerned when you wrote back in 2007 about having lunch with Ina Garten.
Oh, right. Barefoot Contessa. So
Yes.
I'll tell you that story real quick because it does have a relationship to this book. I went to Paris. I went to Paris to cover the Paris Motor Show. And while I was there, I took the cooking class that Patricia Wells teaches. And if anybody has the book, you'll see that Patricia was very nice to write a blurb for the book. So I took her cooking class and she asked me if I knew her friend Ina Garten. And I said no, but at some point I wanted to meet her. When I got back, the New York Times said, we're starting profiles of people that don't normally get profiled as business people. Who would you like to profile? And I said, how about Ina Garten as a businesswoman? And I knew her husband, Jeffrey. So her husband, Jeffrey, professor at Yale, expert on the auto industry. And I emailed Jeffrey and I said, would Ina talk to me for a profile in the New York Times? She was just beginning to be the celebrity that she is now. And he talked to her and she emailed me and said, come on out to East Hampton and I'll talk to you and I'll make you lunch and we can have as much time as you need. So that was a pretty exciting moment for me. And it actually kicked off my ability to be a food writer. So here we are, almost 15 years later, and I've written a book about a food company.
Well, I'm still envious of that conversation that you got to have. And of course, people should also know that you've got this amazing Culinary Woman newsletter. Mm-hmm. You've written about food and drink for Forbes. So honestly, I'm not at all surprised that a place like Zingerman's would choose you to chronicle their history, their people. You're a foodie, you're a hell of a writer, and you're a Michigander. So it all comes together. Terrific.
Thanks. Thanks.
And I mostly want to talk about the food parts of this book. But I think if I do, everybody's going to go like running to the refrigerator to rummage around the kitchen. And so I'm going to save that for last.
Okay, sure.
So Mickey, let's start with a story that's the kind of the way all good buddy movies should start out. A meeting of the two minds behind this whole thing. How did Ari Weinswag and Paul Saginaw meet?
So I see that we have a few Zingerman's people that are attending, or former Zingerman's people that are attending the program tonight. Hi, everybody. And also I'm wearing blue and gold for both the University of Michigan and for Ukraine. So I just wanted to say go blue in two ways. Ari and Paul actually met through the University of Michigan, not in class or anything like that, but Paul was managing a restaurant in downtown Ann Arbor called Maud's. And Maud's was the kind of place that served sort of contemporary cuisine. We kids like to go there just ourselves, and then we would go if our parents wanted to go. And Ari was a student at the University of Michigan, and he was a Russian studies major. And Paul was used to hiring University of Michigan students for a semester or whatever. They'd come, they'd kind of learn how the restaurant worked, earn some money for school, and then graduate and move on. And Ari came in, and I think he worked first as a dishwasher, but he had a real interest in what was going on in the kitchen and an interest in learning about food. And he started suggesting ideas to Paul, and he and Paul just hit it off. They found themselves to be simpatico. They both liked to read a lot. They would read books and pass them back and forth and discuss them. And I think at the time, Paul lived in an apartment building with a roof deck, and they would lie out in the sun and, talk about Kierkegaard or whatever. The interesting thing was both of them are Jewish. They grew up eating deli food, although Ari says, and it's in the book, that at home he ate Kraft macaroni and cheese and white bread and Cheetos. He was not a gourmet at home at all. Paul had a little more exposure in the city of Detroit to the old school delis where you had these giant sandwiches with the Russian dressing. And they both thought that Ann Arbor would be a great place to have a deli because we have a large Jewish community. I'm not Jewish, but we have lots of neighbors who were, and my mother always bought the bagel boxes from the Hadassah ladies, and we would buy bagels that were brought in from Detroit. We didn't have a bagel place then. We didn't really have a real deli then. They were more like sandwich shops. And so Paul and Ari were convinced that Ann Arbor had the right kind of a market to support the dream deli that they wanted to create.
But they didn't do that right away. They had those conversations, and then it just kind of petered out, and they went and did their own things. And then how did they come back together?
Well, so Ari actually moved away from Ann Arbor and lived in San Francisco for a while, and Paul got married to Lori, and they were starting to raise their family. And the Main Street Ventures group, which owned Maud's, offered him the opportunity to buy in. And he thought about it, and they actually got a second mortgage on the house. And in the meantime, Ari came back to town, and they started talking again about this dream deli that they wanted to do. And so instead of using the money for the second mortgage to buy into Main Street Ventures, they decided that they would use it to form their deli. And Ari had a little legacy from a grandmother. And the two of them were able to put some seed money together. And all they needed at that time was a place to put it.
You know, you talk in the book about the nostalgia that's brought up by the idea of this classic deli. And, you know, I'll tell you, even though I didn't grow up with one anywhere near me here in Portland, I know exactly what that nostalgia is, especially after 15 years in LA with Langer's.
Sure, yeah.
But you write that Paul and Ari didn't just want a deli, they wanted an outstanding deli.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
So if people now, I mean, if you're lucky enough to live in a big city, so Chicago has Manny's, New York still has Katz's and Russ and Daughters. You guys, LA has Langer's. I think the difference is that just a deli, it's a sandwich. You know, it might be a big sandwich, but it's not anything special. It's meat and cheese and bread. But these great delis, you know, they took care with their rye bread. They took care with the corned beef. They made the corned beef themselves. They had the great dressings. They had the cheese. These sandwiches are huge. I remember dating someone in New York, and we went to the Stage Deli because he thought that was better than the Carnegie Deli. And we would get one sandwich and order extra bread and then remake the sandwich into two sandwiches. And so they just had this idea that if they were going to do this, they wanted it to be the best possible meat, the best possible bread, great dressing, great cheeses, and just not compromise at all.
So Zingerman's, there's a long story in the book about, you know, kind of the first years, they weren't easy, but ultimately it becomes an institution, well known, not just locally, but nationally. So I want to fast forward to March of 2020.
Oh, okay.
The pandemic comes along.
Yeah.
Tell us about how Zingerman's survived those first few months, and how it seems like mail order, which was already in place, probably saved the company.
Absolutely. I think you can absolutely say that. So just for people who aren't familiar with what Zingerman's became, so it started as a single deli, but by about 2015, it had grown to a dozen businesses. It was making its own bread, roasting its own coffee, making its own cheese. It had a training company, you know, on and on and on. And so by 2019, their revenues were about $70 million, which is pretty incredible for what started in a little brick building. And at that point in time, I had been talking to literary agent about writing this book, and the literary agent and the woman who became my editor at Scribner's, Kara Watson, and I set up a call with Ari on March 15th, 2020. And that was actually the day of Zingerman's 38th anniversary, but it was also the day that Governor Gretchen Whitmer issued a shutdown order for the state. So Ari came to the meeting and on the phone and he said, this is the worst day of my life. I had to lay off 300 people. And at that point, they'd never laid off anybody. Even during the recession in 2008 and 2009, when the car companies went bankrupt, didn't lay anybody off. Well, right away, they had to close two of the restaurants had to close for indoor service. They could do carry out. The deli was allowed to do carry out and delivery, but they weren't allowed to be open inside. A lot of the other businesses could only do pickup kind of stuff. And their revenues dropped from about 70 million to 45 million overnight. But what happened was the mail order business, which had always been a significant part of the business since it started in around 1999, they were flooded with orders because people were stuck at home all across the country. They were working from home. They were hungry. they were looking everywhere to get good food, and they were probably already Zingerman's customers who just seized upon Zingerman's. And then there were articles in all sorts of publications saying, you're stuck at home, but you want something good to eat. Well, use Zingerman's mail order. And so overnight, they had always had a flood of business at Christmas time. And it was like Christmas every day at mail order. And I think it's safe to say that, especially in that first year of the pandemic, that mail order saved the company.
Clearly, the watchword for just about any corporation at that point in time was to be nimble, or the infamous pivot that so many companies had to do.
Sure.
And I think a lot of the companies that not only survived but were able to even thrive coming out of lockdown were the ones who were well managed and forward-looking already. And Zingerman's was a company that was known not just for its food, but also for how it ran its business.
Right.
What were some of the unique things about Zingerman's that prepared it for the pandemic, even if it didn't realize, obviously nobody did, that was the case?
So Zingerman's has a management philosophy that they call it a three-legged stool. And one is good food, one is good service, and one is good finances. And it's never been a 10% net income number. It's never been, we want to do gross margins of 15%, blah, blah, blah. It's always been, we want to have enough money to run the business, enough money to give our employees decent pay and benefits, and enough money to invest across the businesses and start new businesses. So it wasn't like they were a General Motors that had to earn $8 billion a year only to go to zero. They were a company that had always said, let's do what we can to keep going. So one of the very interesting things that I found that I wrote about is that the whole idea of employee suggestions, they call it bottom line change. So they welcome from any level in the company an idea that will make things easier for the way the process goes, better for the customers, possibly easier to maintain if it's something that's equipment, and something that will just sort of delight everybody to do. And anybody from a server to a bartender to one of the the management partners can make a suggestion at any time. And then there's a whole system of how do we kind of game this out so that we can do this. And literally, if you walk into their sit-down restaurant, which is called the Roadhouse, they're actually visible results of this process. One is in the blue plate specials that they serve for breakfast and lunch. And one is in the big juicer that they use to make the limeade that I order in fact, I have some in my refrigerator that I order pretty much every time I go in there. And all over Zingerman's, you'll see examples of these employee ideas that were then put into effect.
Oh, I love that. So not only creating change from the ground up, but one of the hallmarks of business management for this company is something that Paul calls visioning. And this is not something that I was familiar with.
Yeah.
He realized that the store had a mission, but not a vision.
Right.
What's the difference, and how does it play into both the everyday and the long run operation of the store?
So there's a book, a very popular management book called Start with Why, that Simon, I think it's pronounced Sinek or Sinek, wrote a few years ago. And his point is that you can't be a business that says, I'm going to have $70 million in sales. That's not a why. The why is the good food, the good service, and the good finances. You know, the why is I want to create a sandwich with the Russian dressing dripping down my arms that's better than any sandwich ever served in Ann Arbor. You know, so that's the first thing. The whole idea that they have this mission, this reason for being, but that doesn't get you to $70 million. And actually, it's not the $70 million, it's the 12 companies, it's being innovative, it's being offering opportunities to people. So they do this process called visioning. And visioning is essentially you write, it's almost like writing a screenplay. It's 2020, and in 2025, we would like to have 3 more businesses. We would like to have a brewery. We would like to own our own farm. We would like to make tortillas ourselves. And then you say, you know, why would we like to do those things? Well, craft beer is very popular with Zingerman's customers. Tortillas will allow us to add things to our menu that we're not currently offering. And what was the third one that I said? So tortillas, a brewery, it's a farm. If we have a farm, then we can offer more plant-based foods, kind of thing. And then, so that's the vision. You're painting the picture of where you want to be. And then you start to fill in the steps as you go along. But it isn't the steps first that go to the vision, it's the big picture. And then, you know, it's sort of pointillism where you think of the big picture and then the little dots come after that.
As I was reading about Zingerman's and really their management focus, and you know that it's not only internal, but the way they manage is actually has been exported outside the company as well. Mm-hmm. And it actually reminded me a bit of the fish management book that Pike Place Fish Market put out about 20 years ago. Yeah. I want, is there something about food purveyors that the management gurus? I don't know. Do Ari and Paul look back and wonder, how did that happen?
No, actually the management side of it, I think was even certainly as deliberate as the food side, because Paul, so I would say Ari, you know, I call him the philosopher person. And if you read, I for the people in the audience that know about Ari's a very philosophical kind of person, and his newsletters are filled with references that, you know, could be out of a PhD thesis. And some of it goes right over my head. I have no idea, you know, who these people are and why he's referring to them. But then he didn't know who David Attenborough was either. So I got one on him. But he is super thoughtful, super frameworky. And Paul was more of the, how are we going to do it kind of person. And so as a former automotive reporter, I noticed all these parallels with the Toyota production system. Right. And I noticed that there were people who had worked at Toyota that were working at Zingerman's. And I said to Paul, I mean, were you deliberately like echoing what Toyota did? And he said, well, not so specifically, but really early on, I read about Dr. W. Edwards Deming. And Dr. Deming, for people who don't know, is the American who went to Japan in the 1950s when the Japanese auto industry was absolutely crushed after the war. And he helped the Japanese devise quality management systems so that they could get back on their feet efficiently, because there was nothing extra to be had in Japan, but also to tap into the ideas of the employees. And Paul told me that very early on, he read Dr. Deming's 14 points, which are in the book and very famous in the quality world. And I had not only familiarity with Dr. Deming, when I was a fellow at Columbia University, he came and spoke to one of my classes. And so all of a sudden for me, you know, the light bulb goes on and I'm seeing exactly what Paul saw in Deming applied in Zingerman's. And is it sort of native to the food world? Well, I think the food world, if you think about the roots of like French cuisine, it's based on the French military system. And that is a problem in a lot of kitchens because
Right.
it's very hierarchical and very in the old school way. You know, the chef was the general and you did what chef told you to do.
The
Um,
screaming general.
yeah. And you know, but it's set up as a series of food station. You have
Right.
your garde manger, you have your dessert station, you have your fry, you have the person who's the expediter, et cetera, et cetera. And it's prescribed. And I think part of the reason is, you know, food is perishable. So you can't put a salad in the refrigerator and it's going to be good 3 weeks from now. You have to have, you know, LIFO and FIFO, as we say in accounting, last in, first out. You know, you have to get, the inventory has to move. And so in order for kitchens and food companies to be run well, there does need to be some kind of process going on. But what was so interesting to me was that Zingermans didn't look at other restaurants for how they did it. They looked across the business world.
Yeah, fascinating. So yeah, I want to talk to you a little bit about your own relationship with Zingerman's. You write a couple of pages about it in the book's introduction, but I want to delve a little further into why this place is important to you, important enough that you'd want to do a project like this.
Yeah.
Do you have some first memories of going there, of even, I don't know, maybe what you ate the first time you went? Did you live near it?
Somebody, I did a program at the Zingerman's Roadhouse last night, and someone asked me, do you remember your first Zingerman's meal? And I actually don't, which is terrible. If I'd known at the time I was going to write this book, I would have put it in my diary or something. But I was actually not in Ann Arbor the first 10 years of Zingerman's. I was in Detroit, in the city of Detroit. I was in Washington, D.C. I was in New York City, and I came back to Ann Arbor in the mid 90s, and everybody was saying, oh, when was the last time you were at Zingerman's? I'm like, I haven't been there. And so I actually went down because everyone was asking me about Zingerman's, and I thought I better get down there and look around. And I went in and I looked around and I noticed these great big hand-drawn signs around the building that were advertising classes. And I was very interested in taking cooking classes. And so I was making notes to myself of what was, and remember, the internet was just getting started then. So it wasn't like you could log into something and find the list of classes. You literally had to go down and look at the wall and make notes to yourself on what was coming. And so I just started signing up for the classes. And especially as a journalist, we get so burned out during the day that going to a cooking class at night was a really nice way to turn off and do something with my brain that wasn't numbers, you know. So I took a class on chocolate. I took a class on gelato. I took one on making mozzarella cheese, which is really
Burrata?
yeah, we made burrata. We made a braid that I served for Thanksgiving, that kind of thing. I took a cookie class, I took a pie class, and I'm the lady that cried in the pie class because I really am not very good rolling out pastry. But, you know, they were nice to me, they understood. And so my way into Zingerman's was through the classes, and I took a class on balsamic vinegar. And then I started to know what the balsamic vinegars on the shelf were. And so by taking the classes, they introduced me to the products that were sold there. And then really when the Roadhouse opened in 2007, that was when I really started to enjoy eating at Zingerman's, getting into Zingerman's, because I like to sit down and be waited on, and the deli's a scramble. I mean, there are some stories in the book about the very long lines that would develop on football Saturdays. And, you know, I'm not a person that's going to stand in line like 45 minutes to get a corned beef sandwich. I'd like to sit down and have fried chicken, please. So, yeah. And it just became the kind of place where, because there was variety, you know, there was the deli, and my brother and his family liked to go to the deli, you know, they liked that scene. And then my mother, who was older, liked to go to the Roadhouse, and we would go to the movies and have gelato after the movies. And then they have a sort of a counter that faces the kitchen, and it's an open kitchen. And I'm just fascinated by the way kitchens work. So I have my own seat at the end of the counter, and I just went and I listened to everybody doing their job. And I didn't know I was going to write the book. I just got to know all the staff there. So for me, it really became, real part of the fabric of my life. And I just thought, because I'd written a story about them in 2007 for the Times when they celebrated their 25th anniversary, I had gotten to know something about how the process worked. And then when my now agent Irene Goodman suggested it, 13 years later, I thought, well, I found them to be an interesting company. Maybe this would be a good project for me. And then everyone who has heard about the book has said, well, you're the ideal person to write it. So sometimes things just happen that way.
That's great. You described Zingerman's early on as a hub in a global wheel of food.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of us are familiar with some of the other spokes on this wheel, kind of local places that are our Zingermans. In Seattle, of course, there's De La Rente at Pike Place Market, El Mercado, the spice market there as well. Here in Portland, we've got Elephants. Both Seattle and Portland have Uwajimaya.
Right, San Francisco has Buy Right.
Yeah.
And I think the farmers market in LA probably would count as
absolutely
not a
Hollywood
Zingerman
farmers market for sure.
But
So
yeah, absolutely.
when I go into these places, I feel like I am browsing the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine that that's one of the great attractions of this kind of specialty store.
Yeah. Well, I think, we have had a whole bunch of them over the years, so Zabar's in New York City is the closest thing to Zingerman's that I can think of, because they do produce their own bread. They do produce their jams and things like that. They have their whole deli section in the back where they make all the salads and they slice the fish in front of you. So that's a good parallel. And Zabar's does have their catalog. They do mail order. I don't know what their revenue numbers are. And, there's only Zabar's. It's not like there's Zabar's and then you can go to a Zabar's bread store. It's just all in that one section of Broadway. I think the difference for Zingerman's is that probably Ari gets a lot of the credit for this, because starting around 1990, he became a real adventurer in terms of food. He went to Ireland, to Ballymaloe, which is this amazing property with a working farm and a large cooking school, and the Allen ladies. So the original Mrs. Allen, Myrtle Allen, then there's Rachel Allen, and they have 3 generations of Allens who have run Ballymaloe. And all these people from around the world have come there to learn about literally farm to table. It's like a 2-minute walk from the chickens to the kitchen. This is more than any farm to table that you see in a lot of places. So Ari went there, and then Ari went to Italy to learn about olive oil, and then Ari went to Spain and to learn about balsamic vinegar. And he just has become this global traveler, bringing food back with him. And I think because he was so interested in it, then they decided, we're going to stock the world's best balsamic. We're going to stock this wonderful lemon olive oil. We're going to have spices that are curated in Montreal. And we think that people in Ann Arbor are appreciative enough that they'll buy them. And we think our mail order people will buy them as well. And so that's Ari's piece of the business, and his instincts on food are really incredible.
All right, well, let's get to the food.
Yeah, sure.
If anyone is hungry, those hunger pangs are worse.
The thing it's because it's almost supper time out there. It's past.
It is almost, yeah. And for those of us who have never been to Zingerman's, we're going to hear about why the place has a famously huge line. And my first question for you, I want to hear you talk about the coffee cake.
Sure.
In the chapter about the bakehouse, I could practically smell it from 2,000 miles away.
It's
Is there a
amazing.
secret ingredient, and is it something I can order?
Oh, absolutely. You can order it. And actually, the coffee cakes are the #1 most popular thing in the mail order catalog.
All
One of
right.
the reasons is that they're big corporate gifts and gifts that people send for weddings and for shivas, for funerals and things. Like they actually have a bereavement box. So I was spent a day at the bakehouse, and the bakehouse is a large working bakery with its own little shop. So you can actually look through the glass and see all the bakehouse staff making breads and bagels and pretzels. But then there's this whole section where they make the coffee cakes. And if you know those great big bundt things that you can buy, King Arthur Flour sells those big bundt, they're by Nordic Ware. Imagine 24 of them. Imagine an oven that's with like a refrigerator, except you open the door and there are racks in there, and you slide the racks in and you close the door and you hit the button, and the coffee cakes bake. I was about dying because it smells so good. But they take the pan, and they're doing it upside down, right? Because you're going to dump out the pan and the coffee cake's going to be there. And they start with the topping in the bottom, and then they put in this wonderful batter, and then they put in some more of the filling, and then they put in some more batter, and then they have the bottom and they smooth it out, and they're just like making 24 at a time, and it's crazy. It looked to me like one of the most appetizing jobs in the whole place. And I was chatting with one of the women who was doing this, and I said, what's your background? And she said, well, I attended the Culinary Institute of America, and I came out here to do what's called an externship. And she said, I liked it so well that I applied for a job. And then I spoke with another young woman who is working on in the bread station, and she was an engineering graduate from the University of Michigan. And instead of going to work for a tech company out there, she got a job at the bakehouse, and she liked it so much that she decided that she would become a baker. Well, the nice thing about having an engineering degree is that baking has a good deal of engineering and chemistry that goes with it. And then you have people that were just, they were people that worked as servers in the Roadhouse, and they loved baking and they wanted to bake, and they're allowed to change jobs if they want to. And then there are people that are back in the cake decorating area, and they're sculpting these cakes. And it's, now I know we have all those shows on television where you can see the work going on, but it's so interesting to see it like they're making cherry blossoms for one of the cakes while I was watching them, and they're crafting these little bitty things to decorate the cake, and it was just a work of art. So yeah, I mean, and it's fascinating for me to think that this is going on 15 minutes from my house.
I think I would be there every day. So we do have a couple of questions coming up, but I have one more for you, because this is like my favorite thing on earth. Please describe in detail the cheese case.
The cheese case. Oh my goodness. So
if I pass out, somebody please call 911.
So I'll describe the deli. First of all, let me hold up the cover of the book. So I don't think you can see that well, but this is the deli. And
here's mine.
Okay, that's a better one than mine. Okay, so on the left side of the screen in the picture, it's got little loaves of bread, but behind that window, so yes, so see the little loaves of bread. And then behind that window, when you walk in the door to the left, that's where the cheese case is. And this is not just a cheese case that's like 20 cheeses. This is like the whole length of that wall. And there may be as many as 100 cheeses available at any one time. They have about 60 on display, about 20 on shelves behind them, and then they can go in the back and get 20 more. Now remember, Zingerman's has a creamery, so Zingerman's is making its own cheese, which is a really interesting story. They got started doing that because they didn't like commercial cream cheese. They were baking their bagels and they were buying this commercial cream cheese and it had gunk in it, it had preservatives and stuff in it. And they just felt like, this doesn't taste like cream cheese does when you get it from a really good deli in New York. It just tastes like, the stuff you buy in the supermarket. So they literally started the creamery so they could make their own cream cheese. And then they've made goat cheese. They make pimento cheese. They make Lipthauser. Yeah, so they make some that are sold in grocery stores around Ann Arbor. And then all the other cheeses in the case are coming from place. Lots of French cheeses, lots of American cheeses. And they were one of the first places that carried things like Cabot Creamery and some of the other creameries from around the country. And then, as I said, French, Irish, English, they carry Montgomery cheddar. They were one of the first places to do that. They have a relationship in England with Neal's Yard Creamery, and so their cheeses come over. They're definitely a specialist in Parmesan cheese. And I've actually been to a Parmesan class where they had one of those big wheels of Parmesan that looks like a coffee table. And during the course of the evening, they had the little cheese knives in it. And you're watching them to make sure that the thing doesn't fall to the ground or anything. And everybody applauded when they got the cheese open. So if you love cheese or dairy, it's really heaven. And there are definitely some cheeses that are easy, like if you're lactose intolerant, you probably don't want to go there, but they do have different types of milk cheeses. So if you can't do like a cow's milk, they have sheep's milk, they have goat milk, et cetera, et cetera. But honestly, everything's got a story. There's a little story card with everything. And if you want to try a cheese, now they have to give you a sample and you have to go outside to eat it because of COVID. Yeah. But if you want to try it, they'll give you some to take home. You can always call them and say, give me a pound of whatever and I'll come back and pick it up. But yeah, that's it. I would think for a cheese lover, it just has to be, an hour looking at the cheese. Easily.
Well, I think I gained 10 pounds over the last minutes, so.
It's the best way to sample their cheese. It's from 2,000 miles away. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. And I would tell everyone the full story in here of how this place came to be and how it became such an institution is really worth paging through. I really enjoyed it, Mickey. So thank you for birthing it. So folks, if you have a question, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom. Don't raise your hand. Just write something in the Q&A and I'll translate that for Mickey. And we actually already have a couple, so let me go to that. Jill asks, how does Zingerman's look at business units that are having difficulty becoming profitable?
That's a good question.
And what are some of their businesses that failed?
Well, actually, they only had one that failed completely. They had a produce business back in the 80s, and I only remember it because I'm from here. I think they'd prefer that nobody remember it, but they tried to do fresh produce. And remember what I said about them starting the bakery, because they were running to Detroit 4 times a day to get rye bread, and they just couldn't run to Detroit anymore. And the same with produce. I mean, produce is its own thing. And at the time they had the produce company, there really weren't local growers that could provide produce to them. And our farmers market here was only an okay farmers market. The whole farm to table thing had not really bounced up at that point. And so the produce company just failed miserably. But that's about it. I mean, they're very careful about the areas that they go into. And they did learn during the pandemic, and Paul is very candid about that in the book, that they wanted all the businesses to stand on their own 2 feet. And what they found was that there are about 4 or 5 really strong businesses that were supporting the businesses that weren't doing as well. But I will say, one of the things that they do when a business gets in trouble is they surround it and they pitch in and they come up with ideas to make it more innovative. So, for example, the coffee business did a really strong wholesale business, but the candy business was just a little too gourmet in a way for it to be commercially viable. They produce these candy bars that are larger than like a drugstore candy bar, and they're very high quality ingredients, but they're not cheap. They're like $6 for a candy bar, which I know in a gourmet store isn't that much, but you're not going to just go in and buy one for like a child or something. And so candy was really suffering during the pandemic. And what they did was they combined the coffee and the candy companies, and then they basically had opened a candy store, and they closed the candy store and moved all the candy into the coffee company. And so when you walk in there now, there's like the coffee bar area, and then there's a candy store. So instead of having two businesses that had a wall between them, they have one coffee business, and then you go shop for candy. So if you want a little chocolate to go with your coffee, it's right there. If you want marzipan fruit to take home, it's right there. And then they started to bring in different kinds of chocolate. And then they also started to do different variations on their chocolate. And I think the thing is, it's not super successful yet, but they hope it can be more successful. And then in terms of the creamery was bouncing along, and they ran into some issues with the FDA, and the FDA was imposing requirements. And as a small creamery, it was just going to be prohibitively expensive for them to meet those requirements. They decided to do it. And then they caught the attention of a gentleman from Chicago who was a wealth manager, but his family had a farm in Michigan, and they sold organic milk. And he came to Zingerman's to see if they'd be interested in buying the milk. And he got intrigued by the creamery, and he decided to invest in the creamery. He left his wealth job in Chicago at State Street, and he now lives in Ann Arbor, and he's running the creamery. So I think some of it is a little accidental and some of it is deliberate. But they will do everything they can to avoid having one of their businesses fail. If they have to put it on hiatus for a while they figure it out, they'll do that. That's what they did with food tours, because you couldn't travel. And they didn't, they had to cancel all the bookings for food tours. Well, Christy, who runs food tours, was allowed to start a wine shop in her food tours office. And she sells organic wines, and she sells from small producers around the world. And so her wine store got up and running, and it's doing pretty well. And now food tours is starting up again. So they didn't just say goodbye, Christy. They let Christy try a plan B until the plan A could come back.
Another famous pivot.
There you go.
Okay, another question. Is Z World renowned for their olive oils and vinegars? And what else gives them an international reputation?
Yeah, so they were one of the first places. In fact, there's a story in the book about olive oil, because the gentleman who became their artist, Steve, actually came to work there. And the first day he was there, they handed him a notebook that explained the olive oil process. And he said, "You can get oil out of olives?" And so I think they started with olive oil in the 80s, when people started to become aware of quality olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, that kind of thing. And then it was actually, I think, Chuck Williams at Williams Sonoma that popularized balsamic vinegar. But then Ari went and met the balsamic vinegar producers. He went to Modena. He brought the producers here. I remember taking that balsamic vinegar class, and they gave us a little sampler of 4 different ages of balsamic vinegar. And they will, they are it's a little more difficult now, but they used to have tastings right in the department with these little plastic spoons, and you could taste the different ages of balsamic vinegar and decide which one you wanted to try. And so I think those are the two things that that got attention here locally. And then because of mail order, that was how they made these products available across the United States and somewhat internationally. I think internationally their scope is more that they find the international producers and bring them into Zingerman's. And Zingerman's has had an impact on places like Neal's Yard, which I mentioned earlier, because Zingerman's people have gone to work at Neal's Yard. So it kind of is, it's sort of a in and out sort of thing. They meet the producers, they bring the producers to Ann Arbor, then sometimes people from Ann Arbor go to work at the producers, and then they're always looking for new products. And so that's sort of how it all knits together.
This next question, I will say, is a huge part of the book, but we'll have you do an answer to this anyway. Saying their customer service is essentially the best ever.
Oh,
How did it get so good?
well, this is the sort of basis of the Zingerman's philosophy, and it isn't so much that the customer is always right. But the customer's point of view is always valid, and everyone deserves respect. And it includes the people who work at Zingerman's, but also the approach to the people that come into Zingerman's. They treat you like you're the only customer in the world. And if you might have to wait to get someone's attention, although it isn't like it once used to be. And when you want something, they will give you their undivided attention for how much time it takes. And they don't care if you buy one bagel, a whole pound of, $40 cheese, 10 kinds of meat. I mean, you're going to get the same regard that you will get no matter who you are. And I've never walked into the deli without, there's the bread area in the front of the store is called the bread box. And right now it has plexiglass, so it actually is a box. And the bread box person is in charge of greeting you, and someone will greet you no matter which part of Zingerman's you go into. I mean, you are seen. And I think that is hugely important, especially at this time in our lives when we're all kind of fragile and feeling vulnerable. And the fact that someone gives you a smile and a greeting and asks what they can do for you, and then they always ask you, what else can I do for you? You're never allowed to just buy your half a loaf of bread. They want to know, well, do you want like a pretzel to go with that? So that I think makes a huge difference. And Ari has written an entire book on customer service, and I summarize it in my book. But Rick Bayless, who's the owner of the Frontera Group in Chicago, thinks that the customer service side of Zingerman's is the most important side of Zingerman's. And for him, working with Zingerman's, he's brought that customer service approach to his employees.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more. Is it intentional that their business is a mix of vertical and horizontal integration? Very good business.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So I noticed the vertical integration right away. I mean, if you look at a Zingerman sandwich, and for people who aren't up on the term, vertical integration means that you produce at least some, if not all, of what you end up selling. So if you think about the car companies, at one point, General Motors made 70% of the parts on its cars. Ford made about half of them. And the whole story was that, the iron ore would come down from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan on the giant freighters, and they would unload it in Detroit. And then that would all be, processed and made into car parts, that sort of thing. So with Zingerman's, there's a good deal of vertical integration, and I think you'll see a lot of it in the deli, because like a corned beef sandwich, they have prepared the brisket and turned it in, brined it and cooked it and turned it into the meat that's sliced for the sandwich. They have made the bread for the sandwich. They have I think they make the dressing right there. The only thing that they don't make is they actually put Swiss cheese on it. And they don't produce Swiss cheese in the creamery. If you wanted cream cheese, I don't know why you put it on corned beef, but
Ew.
did. I know, I'm sorry. Wrong vision. But if you wanted cream cheese, it would be their cream cheese. Okay. So in terms of horizontal, they're not going to make balsamic vinegar, because authentic balsamic vinegar comes from, 2 regions in Italy. But they are going to be constantly on the lookout for products that fit into the quality that Zingerman's offers. I've had all kinds of conversations with them about pasta, because they have some very pricey pastas in the pasta department. I was shopping one day and I came across this package of spaghetti and it was $19. And I said, $19 for spaghetti? Well, then they had a tasting and I tasted the spaghetti, and it was beautiful spaghetti, and it had the right texture to soak up sauce. I'm not sure I would still spend $19 on a bag of spaghetti. I would buy like the $9 spaghetti because it's very good too. But it's sort of like, this is who we are. This is what we'll make ourselves. And then these are the things that we simply can't make. I mean, we can't make Irish cheese. We can't make balsamic vinegar. We don't have, Michigan, if you have olive trees, they're in a greenhouse somewhere. So you're not going to be making olive oil here, although we have a wine industry, but we don't have an olive oil industry. And so I think it's a question of, can we do it ourselves? Is it cost effective? Do we have the expertise to do it ourselves? If they don't have the expertise, then they look outside for it.
All right.
Hey.
Well, thank you. That was an absolutely delightful conversation, and it's so
Great.
wonderful to see you. And Laura, I will send it back to you.
Yeah, that was really great. Thank you so much, Tess, for leading such a fascinating discussion. Mickey, that was great. I'm just so excited about your book. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure,
Thank you, everyone, for all the great questions that you asked. We had a former sandwich maker on here. We had, actually, Mickey, I will ask you, someone wanted to know if you happen to know how they get the bread for the sandwiches so perfectly crispy. Did that secret come across in your research?
Yeah, it's in the book, but it's kind of a twice baked process. So they bake it, and then they don't bake it completely the first time. And then they put it, if we're talking about rye bread, for example, then they'll put it in for like a second bake. They make many kinds of bread too. So there are some that aren't as crispy as the rye bread, like the pecan raisin bread, I think is only baked once, but they do follow a very old school kind of a process for it. And I think that same process is used at delis, old school delis in LA and other places. It's just that, in the modern world, we've stopped doing things like that. We do the one bake and then everybody's just going to have to deal with it. And they don't believe that. They want it crispy.
Oh, that's really great. I'm like ready to get on a plane now and go.
Yeah, come.
Or at least at a minimum, order one of those coffee cakes.
Yeah, sure. Mail order will definitely send you one. Yeah.
Oh, Mickey, congratulations on the book, and thank you again for being here and celebrating it with us. Tess, thank you. Everyone have a great evening. The book again is Satisfaction Guaranteed, and the talk will be up on our YouTube channel sometime tomorrow or Saturday, probably tomorrow. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Great to see everybody. Bye-bye.